Good evening. Welcome to the Auburn Avenue Research Library. We thank you for coming to this program. And before we get underway, I would like to introduce Dr. Carolyn Denard. Dr. Carolyn Bernard, PhD, founder and board member of Toni Morrison Society. Carolyn Denard received her BA in English from Jackson State University, her MAT in English from Indiana University, and her PhD in American Studies from Emory University, where she focused on 20th century American literature and cultural history, and where she completed a doctoral dissertation on Toni Morrison. Her scholarly research focuses on African American myths, ethics, and cultural tropes in Toni Morrison's fiction. A leading authority on Morrison, she has contributed to critical anthologies and essay collections on Morrison's work, and she is editor of What Moves at the Margin, Selected Nonfiction by Toni Morrison, and Toni Morrison Conversations, a collection of interviews. She is currently completing a book-length manuscript titled Tar Women and Magical Men, Myth and Heroism in Toni Morrison's Fiction.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I close enough to this microphone? Good. So good evening, everyone. Thank you. I am pleased tonight to be in the wonderful space of the Auburn Research Library, Auburn Avenue Research Library, to introduce our featured guests for the evening. As a black woman born and raised in the South, who went to Jackson State University when Margaret Walker was on the faculty there, and having spent my professional life teaching African American literature, to be here tonight to introduce two Southern black women writers, both born in Georgia, I might add, to talk about a phenomenal and much anticipated book about Margaret Walker, I feel that I am in exactly the right place. All the personal and literary stars have lined up for me tonight to be in this place on this occasion. More than knowing these two women as professional, accomplished writers, I am also pleased and honored to say that I also know them as friends. I like to say about Mary Emma what Nell said about Sula. We were girls together. And while we did not grow up together in Augusta, we met each other as young women who were married mothers, college professors, teaching, attending conferences with children in tow, negotiating tenure, moving, writing, and just doing it all together. That early friendship and the vision of Mary Emma with hands full of books, graded papers, and 4 children comforted me and let me know that this could all be done if you could find a friend to go along with you on the journey. We have continued that friendship for more than 30 years with our past intersection with postdocs at Harvard and with her serving as president of the Toni Morrison Society and working now together even now on her transformative archival project, The History of Black Writing. Tayari, of course, I met much later through a mutual friend. But she has a homegirl vibe that comforts you, that makes you feel you can tell her all your secrets, that makes you smile and feel welcomed. I have appreciated getting to know Tayari and appreciating not only her novels, but her essays. I might say her essay, Nothing Virtuous in Finding Common Ground, spoke to me and my students deeply about the history and integrity taught to Tayari by her father. We have also shared a love for dinner parties and doing the feeding and loving on friends in the way that black Southern women do. Most recently, I have been in awe not only of Tayari's leadership and in the academy as a new chair of creative writing of the creative writing department at Emory University, but also her leading the effort with her classmate as a $1 million fundraiser for her beloved college president, Dr. Johnetta Cole. I am proud and glad to call both these wonderful, dynamic women my friends. And now for the formal introductions. Tayari Jones was born in Atlanta and raised in the Southwest Cascade Heights neighborhood. After graduating from Benjamin Mays High School, Tayari attended Spelman College. During her time at Spelman, she studied under Pearl Clegg. Janetta Cole, the first black female president at Spelman, also served as a role model and mentor. Tayari graduated from Spelman in 1991 and went on to complete a master's degree in English from the University of Iowa in 1994 and a Master of Fine Arts in Fiction from Arizona State University in 2000. She has received many fellowships, including from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and the United States Artists. Tayari has written 4 critically acclaimed novels: Leaving Atlanta, which won the 2003 Hurston Wright Legacy Award for debut fiction. The Untelling, also set in Atlanta, won the Lillian Smith Award in 2005. Her novel, Silver Sparrow, was chosen as a #1 indie pick by the American Booksellers Association. An American Marriage, her 4th novel, was published on February 6, 2018. On the same day, Oprah Winfrey announced that American Marriage would be a pick for Oprah's book club, and that she plans an adaptation of the novel for film. In 2018, it was on the summer reading list of President Barack Obama. A story of love and injustice in the prison system, An American Marriage also won the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2019. Tayari is now working on her 5th novel, also about Atlanta neighborhood, called The 4th Ward. And she just released a book on the writer's craft with her colleague, Jericho Brown, called How We Do It. She has also edited a collection of nonfiction essays called Atlanta Noir and written essays for major publications. She is, as I said, currently chair of creative writing in the creative writing department at Emory. Miriam Graham was born in Augusta, Georgia. After graduating from high school in Augusta, she attended and received her BA at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She received her Master's of Arts in English from Northwestern University and her PhD in English from Cornell. Her first major publication was an interview with the late novelist Frank Yerby, which appeared in Essence magazine, establishing Yerby as an important figure in the history of black writing. By the 1980s, recovery work became a central component of her scholarly interests. While a graduate student at Northwestern, she met Walker and became a lifelong admirer and scholar of her work. Throughout her career, she's published with Walker 3 edited collections of her poetry, including For My People, of her novel, Jubilee, and also a collection of essays titled Black, Female, and Free. In 1983, Dr. Graham founded the History of Black Writing, a documentary, literary, and archival project which has been devoted to the preservation and teaching of African American literature and culture since its inception. In 2011, she edited with Jerry Ward, the Cambridge History of African American Literature. The Cambridge History was the first African American literary history to appear in the 21st century. Based on the research compiled in the history of black writing, it has become one of the most influential books that opened the door for important new scholarship. Currently, Dr. Graham is University Distinguished Professor of English at the University of Kansas, where she has been since 1998. Throughout her career, Dr. Graham worked faithfully and continually on what is no doubt the definitive biography of Margaret Walker, The House Where My Soul Lives, The Life of Margaret Walker. It was published by Oxford University Press in December of 2022. The House Where My Soul Lives, I believe it is fair to say, has been the life work of Miriam Graham for the last 25 years. Nearly all of the time I've known her, she has been working on the life of Margaret Walker, whether having conversations while eating her Southern food at Walker's table while a student at Northwestern, or conducting and publishing interviews with her editing work, and finally finishing the comprehensive biography of her life. Miriam has been personally and professionally yoked to Margaret Walker for a quarter of a century. I am delighted that she has completed this monumental work, not just because she's able to see the finished product of this project that she has lived and worked for so long, but also because it's because of the debt it pays and honor it gives to the pioneering work of Margaret Walker, who has not been a marquee name in American literature, but whose poetry, For My People, and her novel, Jubilee, and her visionary teaching and institutional leadership at Jackson State University have been profound and enduring. I am therefore deeply honored to introduce Miriam and Tayari, my friends, these two Southern literary cultural workers who are here tonight to have a conversation about this wonderful biography of Margaret Walker, about writing about the Black South, and about preserving Black history. The cultural word work, as Toni Morrison calls it, which they are doing for all of us. Please join me in welcoming Miriam Graham and Tayari Jones to the stage.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. And we know there's a lot going on this evening, so we appreciate you choosing this event. And we are so excited to talk to you about Margaret Walker Alexander. Nikki Giovanni famously said, Margaret Walker is the most famous person that nobody knows. And we're going to change that this evening. So why don't we just get started? Mariama, why don't you tell us, who was Margaret Walker Alexander?
So many of you grew up in a culture that is very common in the South, where your poetry reading contests, you have to learn poems. For My People is probably the most widely spoken, recited, memorized, performed poem. It is an anthem, actually. And so people don't necessarily know Margaret Walker, but they know the poetry. A book, Jubilee, in 1966, has been translated in 7 languages. It has never been out of print and still circulating. And it was 20 years before the kind of fiction that she sort of helped to usher in became commonplace. So Morrison's book was 1986. Walker did not see herself writing a neo-slave narrative. She was thinking about a folk novel. It was a story that she was was instructed to tell, to keep, because it's a family story, but it's fictionalized. So people read Jubilee and still didn't know Margaret Walker. Most people do know Margaret Walker who went to Jackson State University and encountered her in the classroom, and the state of Mississippi knows her very well, but the rest of the world really only knew those 2 pieces of Margaret Walker. The part of her life that became too overly celebrated, of course, was the fact that she dared to sue Alex Haley and tried to be very honest and forthright about it. And even though the suit was actually legitimate, it was correct, it was absolutely on time and on point, of course she lost at the time that he was still living. The courts decided against her, though other people sued him and they won. After he died, of course, it was determined that that suit was in fact valid, very valid, and that what Alex Haley had done was to create a narrative. It was not authentic. It had been borrowed deeply, extensively from other people, especially Margaret Walker. But it was too late for anything to change in her life. So when people got to know her as a person, as Margaret Walker, they got to know her through that form. Nikki Giovanni says the most famous person because she comes up everywhere and in everything, the good and the bad.
And I mean, this is a lot of life. This right here is, this book is massive, and I could not stop reading it. The details, I mean, you take Margaret Walker from when she was a little girl, and when she was living in Birmingham, then when she moved to New Orleans, from Birmingham to New Orleans, then up to Chicago. Yeah, and you know all of her feelings. How did you get such an intimate look at her life?
I was extremely fortunate. Walker kept journals from the time she was 12 years old. And we know that journals are our best friends. And she couldn't tell a lot of stuff to her parents or to other people, but she told everything in her journal. It is a tell-all, for sure. So 140 or so journals I read.
How many?
140, and now these are composition books. You remember what I'm talking about, the composition style book? 150, 63, both sides of the page, by hand. She wrote from the time she was 12 years old and the time that she could not write anymore, probably until about 1997, when she had cancer and she was in and out of treatment, and therefore her ability to write was limited. But those journals gave me her thoughts. Those journals gave me her feelings. Those journals gave me her anger. And those journals gave me the resolutions that she came to in counseling herself through all of those life experiences. And she had a lot. So she left me, and I felt that, as I tell people, there are 3 voices in the book. I felt that Walker's voice needed to be preserved. So it's long because I try to incorporate as much of her statements about things as possible. So Walker had a lot to say.
I also have a number of really beautiful photographs.
That too was a great fortune of mine, because Walker, long before the idea of archives became so important, Walker documented everything she did. Walker was an institution builder. We know that in 1973 she had this major conference on Phyllis Wheatley. She was introducing people to the idea of the public humanities before the phrase was coined. And that was, 60s and 70s with her institute that she founded at Jackson State. But in everything she did, she had photographers present. Even in the festival in 1973, she had the radio station, the public television station at Jackson State, not Jackson State, at the state of Mississippi. They had public television at the time, one of the first stations. She had the videographers come over, the cameramen come over to video her conference.
And it means a lot because, now everybody has a phone in their pocket.
Right.
But I mean, most of us are old enough to remember when taking a picture, film was an expense. Getting those pictures developed was an expense. And the fact that she thought to capture everything. Can we do a slideshow now? All right, let's dim these house lights.
So, but that idea of having, and those photographers, one of them I also want to give a shout out to Roland Freeman, who passed in August, and he was one of her photographers. So those black photographers were her best friends, and so they gave her an awful lot, and so they gave us the story that we could not capture. So for those of you who don't know Walker, this is just of a snapshot, literally, of who she was from birth through her career, and let me share those with you. This is a bust of Phyllis Wheatley done by Elizabeth Catlett,
Hold your mic up.
a very famous artist, sculptor, who was a very good friend of Margaret Walker's. They were roommates at the University of Iowa, where both were in the arts, one in sculpture or art. Walker was in creative writing, and where she wrote her book, Jubilee. But they were best friends, remained best friends throughout their life, and was commissioned to do a bust of Phyllis Wheatley for that 1973 conference, and that's what you see there. She came from an artistic family. This is her mother, who had the orchestra founded the orchestra, directed the orchestra at New Orleans University, which is now Dillard College. New Orleans University at that time. So Marion Walker was a professional woman well before her time. This is New Orleans. Again, she had a private music studio. So Walker grew up with a mother who had ideas about what she wanted to do, and she did it. So there is no surprise that her daughter decided that she could do the same. So this is a graduation photo of Walker. She finished very early at 15 and started college locally in New Orleans. Again, New Orleans University, now Dillard University, and before she went to Northwestern to complete her education, her undergraduate education. During her time in those 2 years in New Orleans at the university, she met Langston Hughes. They too became lifelong friends, and of course encouraged her work. She had been writing poetry, had a full year of poems in a day book, and she shared them with Langston, and Langston said, "Get her out of the South." His famous or infamous words, and that is what happened. She wanted to go to school. Parents were afraid because she was very young, but when Langston said, if you want her to really develop her talent, she needs to go elsewhere. And we can talk about that in terms of what that means to say get her out of the South, but she was committed to doing that at some point. This is, of course, the great-grandmother, Tayari, who is the main character, the protagonist in the novel Jubilee. Elvira was the great-grandmother, and it was a story that her grandmother told her. So Walker recreated that story for the novel Jubilee. But that is the picture of her grandmother, Margaret Duggins Ware Brown, called Tayari in the book. So a background for those of you who want to know, again, Gilbert Academy as her elementary and high school, and then New Orleans University. Completed her graduate work at the University of Iowa after college at Northwestern. She was writing poetry the entire time, which is her first form. This is the life that Walker wanted for herself. She wanted marriage, she wanted to have children, and that is her loving husband, Alex, always known as Alex, and the 4 children that were born to the Alexander family. Sigismund, Ernest, Marion, and Margaret. Margaret, the youngest, was named after her, obviously. Mary was named after her mother. Sigismund was named after her father. And Ernest was named after her husband. Those are the books: poetry, fiction. I was able to work with her on editing collections of essays because my personal opinion is that Walker really was a brilliant essayist. Since she wrote so many of those essays in her journals and in unpublished manuscripts, we don't know that. So another reason that we don't know her. She had lots to say about everything. The one essay that got published that I would call a sort of political essay was her essay on Clarence Thomas, and she called it, "Whose Boy Is This?" It's a very riveting essay, I assure you, but there was more like it. There's more like it in her journals, but Walker became a writer for all seasons. I mean, when you were a writer, you were a writer. And the writing was something that she never stopped. We just didn't see most of it. We saw a very small portion of it. But these books did get published. When she was asked how she wrote Jubilee, that essay was actually a speech she gave here in Atlanta at the Institute of the Black World. Some of you might know that history. And it explained what research she had done, why she wrote the book, which was another reason why the Alex Haley suit is so important, because she made it really clear where this information came from, the importance of it, and why it was so special to her, because it was what she had researched and what her grandmother had told her. And so you can imagine what it felt like to have somebody rob her of that important information and that personal life experience that she had so carefully protected. She was the guardian of a family history, and that guardianship was disrupted. The poetry books came in interesting moments. In 42, For My People was the first collection of poetry that an African American writer received a national award for. So she was the first award-winning poet within this Black community, and that was in the 40s. The other volumes came later. Prophet for a New Day in the 70s. This Is My Century came in the 90s. It was her last book, and it, of course, has new poems in it as well as the collected poems. And October Journey started in the 40s, but it didn't show up until the 70s. And what I like about October Journey is that Walker was a first in many ways. I've already said that she was the first to get a national award. But I believe she was also the first writer to go on a sponsored book tour. So in 42, the National Artists and Concerts Corporation, I think it's the predecessor of one of those local national organizations that sponsors tours, asked her to go on a tour of northern schools and northern places. Walker agreed under one condition, that she could go to HBCUs first. So Walker went on literally on a paid tour of Black colleges in the 1940s. I don't know many people who did that at that early. I mean, the idea of going on a tour, Tayari, I don't know how you see that in terms of understanding who's done it before. We know people do it all the time now. This was a little unusual. And I do remember people, and got a chance to talk to people, who remembered her coming to their schools when they were 17 and 18. Those people, of course, I interviewed, or they're all dead now. But that was an interesting piece of information I discovered, that she had taken this tour, and took a year. But also, she fell in love during that tour, and that gets another exciting part of her life that we don't know about. But these are the books. There could have been many more, but these are the ones she was able to complete. As I said, I spent my time mainly working with her on essays, because I think that that's really a strength that we don't recognize, and I think that if we get more of those essays in print, you will see some remarkable revelations and understandings of America, American politics, American culture, and her predictions of what we are living through today are in those essays. And so, in addition to being a critic of Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, which is why I thought that essay was one that needed to be included. But again, there are many, many more. So Walker, a published author throughout her life. So she did other kinds of things that I place in this area of the sort of the public humanities. She recorded Langston Hughes, she recorded Paul R. Dunbar for Folkways Records. Anybody remember that old company called Folkways? Well, she was one of their readers. I guess it's the predecessor to podcasts. Walker was reading other people's poetry and talking about the poetry. She read her own poetry, of course, but these are the albums that she was able to do. Elizabeth Catlett also illustrated For My People. The book is an oversized book. It sells today for about $5,000, but it was a 50th anniversary gift to Margaret, her good friend. And again, it was a limited edition, but it was an illustrated collection of art based on For My People. But literally it was this big. Yeah, and that's again a special event in her life. This book, Demonic Genius, was a biography of Richard Wright. Unfortunately, it came after the Roots controversy. And so the response to that book was very negative.
And when you argue that when you call somebody a demonic genius, you in the mood for a fight. I'm just saying. Well, maybe not.
No, tell me more. Tell me more.
No, I'm just saying that I remember when that book came out, and with that title, like you knew, like there's the revered Richard Wright, right? Like Richard Wright was, not at the right hand of Jesus, but maybe the left. And then we
He
have,
was on the left, you're right.
and so then we have a book called Demonic Genius.
So the way Walker understood this,
All right, let's bring our lights up. Here we go.
the way Walker understood demonic genius, those two words coming together. She talked about the impact of living in the South, its inability to recognize brilliance in anybody who's born in its roots, on its shores. Walker loved the South, but the South did not serve everyone to the same degree. She left and came back. Richard Wright had a life in the South that was not one you would wish on anyone. And she was trying to explain what living and growing up in the South had done to him. So the demonic part, it didn't take away his genius. He was a genius, no question about that. But what it did, it created a problem in terms of his acceptance of himself as an African American, as a black person, created a problem in terms of his relationship to other black people, relationships to other black women, because the women in his life were also very difficult. His mother was Seventh-day Adventist, and he was raised in a Seventh-day Adventist household. And so you could not read books other than the Bible. So here you've got this genius who was emerging as a child, and you're squashing the possibility of his growth and development. So the demonic was entitled to explain that conflict. But you're right, it doesn't come off that way. The book does explain it, but the title alone signals something different. Somebody's got a question. Yeah, we do we have... Yes. Yes. Yeah, actually, I was going to say that because Walker was taking the other side of the term. Two things are important here. She knew Greek and Latin. And she explains that in the book. But nobody reads that. People saw it, but the book was trashed. By this time, she had earned the reputation of being an angry black woman. And that stuck. If you sue Alex Haley, you try to explain the complexities of a black man growing up in the South, who is brilliant beyond comparison, but who also has this other quality, and she has the double meaning behind it. You're not going to be well liked. And so she was forced to deal with the consequences of that experience. But the book came after the Haley controversy, and of course, as I said, it was a completely dismissed. I've reread it several times, and I do think that Walker explains psychologically aspects of growing up male in the Black South. And other people have told me that some things she really does hit the nail on the head. But that came later. She came early. In many ways, I say one of her problems is that she came too early for a lot of stuff that she did. She came too early, which meant her acceptance, the revelations that she made were not recognized or honored or respected.
I think that she definitely was in many ways. She was kind of before her time and also caught in between, right?
Okay, yeah.
Because she got a lot of criticism from the next generation of black women writers because of her feelings about gender roles.
Yes, yes. So Walker did not understand feminism or feminist. She encountered that early 60s and 70s. I would say that Walker was an interesting cross between a race woman, an earlier generation of black women who were heavily advocated for women, advocated for the race, but who also believed in the politics of respectability, and therefore would have poo-pooed poo-pooed anything like this that was too radical. So Walker was caught between this race womanhood idea, pro-race, pro-woman. Women are not behind their men. They're doing good work. They're doing everything they should do for the race. There's no question about it. Ida B. Wells, everybody else. But the feminist side of that, she did not understand. There's a passage in the book where Walker says, I am an emancipated woman, not a liberated one. I'm an emancipated woman, not a liberated one. And I think she meant by that, that she was very much a believer in the politics of respectability. But she did not believe that women should just remain silent. So, and her belief in supporting writers and women was never doubted. She called that festival in 1973, it was a women's writers' festival. It was women of her generation who were emerging, and she brought them together. She respected their work. She wanted them to be recognized. So I think those complicated parts of the story do not add up to Walker was anti-woman, certainly not. But she was of her generation. And I think when she wanted to take on a term that would describe her, I think she also liked to use the word, I'm a humanist. She'd like that word. And when we think about the humanities today, that kind of humanism is what really, I think, does come through. That is, you introduce people to a world in many different ways. And those people are better able, through that new knowledge, to be better human beings themselves. And so that betterment of the human race, so to speak, is kind of where she fell. She does, in the book, I reveal her later writings about her development. It comes late, perhaps too late. She says, I see what they mean. I understand what they mean. I can see things in my life that I did not understand. So there's a confessional moment. There are lots of confessional moments. But again, that's in the journal. Those are not public statements.
The whole idea of the journal is, I was just thinking how we today make all manner of public statements on the internet, right?
Right.
I tell my students, don't think of it as a post, think of it as a publication. Are you sure you want to publish what you did last night? But I feel like it really changes your understanding of what you're doing on Facebook when you put it that way. And so I think about her and the privacy of her journals. And I think in reading many of the things you excerpted, she seemed to be a person who all her life was struggling with mental health.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I have to give a shout out to her family, because when she sat out of school, because like many families, they struggle with finances. They were sending their 4 children, they were sending 2 of them to Northwestern, to college. She and her younger sister did end up going to Northwestern, and they had to leave after the first year. Walker had a nervous breakdown when she came back, because she had been exposed into all this new world, new poetry. Modernism was the rage of the time. Poets were in Chicago, and she got to meet those poets. She ended up publishing later in Poetry Magazine, and she got to meet the editor. So Walker was given this opening of a world for her, and then got shut down immediately. But she was also very much a nervous child. She was a child that did not feel comfortable in her skin. Her parents were very protective. They chose her friends for her. She was reading all the time. She was extremely curious. She asked lots of questions. And this was an era when children are seen and not heard. Walker was not a child that would subscribe to that view. So she was in trouble a lot. She was the child.
She had a lot of struggle with her mother.
A lot of struggle with her mother. But she was her father's child. If you know that kind of, what that signals. She's her father's child. He was a quiet man. He was a minister, very thoughtful. He was a reader. He took this daughter of his first child, and allowed her to read all the books he was reading. So she developed intellectually far beyond her puberty years. She's writing poetry. She's asking questions. She's looking at this world around her and wanting to know why it is what it is, now in New Orleans. She's a library kid. She walked to the library and read books all the time.
You know, reading this book, in some ways, it was almost like, I don't want to say not like a reality TV show, but kind of like it, because so many cameos.
Yeah.
Like everybody, she knew everybody.
Well, but she's born in 1915. She lived in 1998. So that means the tail end of what we call the Harlem Renaissance, New Negro Renaissance. She's the tail end of that. She's met Langston Hughes when she's 12 or 13 years old.
Zora Neale Hurston came to visit her mama.
Zora Neale Hurston knew her mother.
Pop by.
Her mother was a musician, trained as a musician, but fell in love, got married, and didn't finish that part of her career. But she
That was
also
a little juicy sidebar. The daddy came over,
Yeah.
and they thought he was there to court the older sister.
oldest
that they were
daughter.
trying to, get out the house, and he was like, "No, I want this one."
Yeah,
It was drama.
yeah, there was a lot more drama about that.
Part of what I love about this book is the way you do not shy away from the juiciness of the story, right?
Well, I
It's
wanted.
very juicy.
Well-
Juicy things
well-
happen. Admit it.
I'll tell you what Walker said to me when she couldn't finish her own memoirs. She wrote 3 versions of her book, but she didn't live to see them through, and they would have, of course, needed to be edited. But she'd given me the outline. And of course, she was telling the story from her perspective, and it was distorted. She said to me, "Nobody's interested in my life because I don't have enough juiciness in it." Now, that's before I read the journals. I went, oh my God, what was she thinking? There's lots of juiciness in her life because she's writing, and of course, again, I hadn't read them at that point. But she felt that biographies of people are always revealing these deep, dark secrets, and she didn't think she had any because her life, she thought, was an open book. She wrote everything down, literally everything. She came home from a meeting, she was mad with somebody, she blessed them out in the journal. Now, that's a really good idea and a practice that I have adopted. Because if I say to people what I want to say sometimes, it's not good. Because I have done it and it's not been good. But
I'm sure they had it coming.
so Walker was, she had her ideas about things. She had strong feelings. She had strong views. She did it in her family life, and her parents were like, "You can't do that. Write it down." They were the ones that gave her the first journal. Just write it down. And so that started her with this idea of, I have a space that's my own. This is my best friend. My journal is my best friend, and I can say anything in my journal. And the fact that she left them in an archive meant to me that she wanted other people to know her story. She didn't, like Ernest Hemingway, burn them. She didn't do that. She gave them to Jackson State. They're all there. Every single page that she wrote from 12 years old on. So the juiciness is there, and I think that it is important to see the full life because Walker was both ordinary and extraordinary. She had a very difficult life. She was the breadwinner for her family, had 4 children. I mean, she had to work. She couldn't just be a writer. She didn't have that luxury. And she did fall in love and get married. And she threatened divorce all the time. There were all kinds of struggles in the marriage. But they made their marriage work. That's another interesting. That's why there's a picture. Do I have a picture? I have a picture of her. I don't know if it's in this one. Let me see. I guess I don't have it. I have a picture of her sitting on her husband's lap because I like the idea that later in their life, and she retired fairly early, they rekindle their life, their marriage. And I thought, okay, she worked through this. She would be self-confessional at times. She knew she talked too much. She knew she talked back to her husband and made him angry. And she'd say, well, why couldn't I just shut up and write that in my journal? You've been doing that all along. But when she was in those little moments, she was just, fighting back. So all
we
of
can
us
all agree that telling
Yeah.
something to somebody in their face is different than writing it down.
Write it
I mean,
down.
sometimes they need to know.
These are marriage fights, marriage squabbles.
Yes, no, she needed to tell him all of that.
Well, she did, but trust me, in the way that the story, I understand it, he transformed.
Because she told him.
He found God, all of the traditional ways in which he went to church, found God, and she said, thank you, Lord, for giving my husband this vision, this strength to do that. So when I say they transformed their relationship, they had this beautiful, say, last 10 or 15 years together. And the most beautiful thing about it, I'm giving away all my good stuff here, is that he would not die until she had finished that last book. He had cancer, inoperable. He was ready to die. He would not die until she penned the last word of that book. So he had been her best friend all along. And in the later years of her life, he drove her to every conference and every speech she gave so they could spend time together. So it's a beautiful love story. I like the book as a love story. A lot of other stuff in there, but I like the love story angle of it.
Well, I think we should take some questions from the audience. All right, come on down. Let's spell my sister.
Hi, I'm Janice Sykes. Is this thing working? Yes. I grew up with, this way. Okay. I grew up with Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander. Okay. And I met you many, many years ago with Dr. Mildred Barksdale. Mildred White Barksdale. I'm the niece.
Yes.
So anyway, I found our Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander to be a wonderful person to a small child. So I grew up with her coming to our farm in Kemper County, Mississippi, since I can remember. Both my parents took the literature classes she taught at Jackson State. They took it in the 1950s. So I grew up with her to the point of her helping open this building when I was the research librarian. And I drove her around. And she always wore hats. And I want to thank you for your diligence. I know how long you've been doing this research. And since we're both young, I won't get into that. But I have followed you through Dr. Mildred over the years, and your collection that you helped to put together of essays, I think it's over the moon, and having been a librarian for 40 plus years, specializing in African American studies, is one of the best collections of essays I've ever seen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Graham. My name is LaRose Davis. I came to University of Kansas a really long time ago, like 2005, 2006. The Black Native conference that you held there, like one of the first ones. You were one of my first publications.
Yes,
working on my
yes.
PhD. Anyway, good to see you again. I have a question. I know you do. I have a question. Did she ever move at all the needle on her perspective about where she placed herself? Like, she lived until 1998, where she placed herself in that sort of continuum of her perspective on feminism. Like, did you see any change, or was it like a consistent, the perspective that she had about her relationship to that philosophy? Was there any change ever, any evolution?
She was changing, absolutely. But the change, as I said, was self-revelation. That is, her thinking about her own history and what other women were telling and talking to her about, and understanding what they meant. So as her understanding grew, she was not about to call herself a feminist, but she was about to accept and understand the reality, the need for it, the importance of it. And I'd say she was one of those people that felt that you could differ with other people, but you did not need to be divided. And so she differed on some things. I said that this notion about emancipation versus liberated, the liberated part had to do with sex, just so you know. She was saying, I can't go there. I believe in marriage. I believe in, this is the era that she's born in. And you marry, you stay married. I mean, that's the kind of person that she is. But she does grow over time. She actually backtracks and tries to explain to herself, the experience I had at Jackson State in my early years, maybe this is what was happening. She thought that the men who criticized her and the difficulty she had with her male colleagues was because she was smart. Sexism had nothing to do with it. And when the president would not let her go off to get her PhD, she called him small-minded. But later in life, she began to realize she got less money than anybody else. She began to add up the dots. The dots started adding up. So yes, there was this evolution over time, but you saw it, again, I saw it in the journal. I did not see it in a public engagement, but in her actions, her support for women writers, prefaces of books, her willingness to support, willingness to take women and to push them, and also the work that she did in what she founded the Institute. Fannie Lou Hamer papers are there. She really was very keen on women's history, collecting information, preserving that information, therefore founded this institute for doing that. So you wouldn't know the evolution of that without reading the journals.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the context on liberated, that language, because I did not have it.
Yeah.
But no, thank you for that. And I'm going to step out because I got another thing, but I don't want to
Thank you.
But good to see you again. Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you very much, too. And then when I saw your flyer and I saw the IBW publication, I worked at IBW from 1970 to 78, but stayed a part of it.
Can you tell people a little bit about that? Because maybe people,
Okay.
Is that a new term for people, Institute of the Black World? Do y'all know about that?
Yes, look us up.
Okay.
I can't remember there's a book about IBW that someone who did never work there wrote. But some of us who now have the IBW Legacy Group have done some programs, and we're talking again about telling the story of IBW. But IBW, the Institute of the Black World, was right there across from a part of the AU Center, and we were an organization that was about intellectual, what shall I say? We were a think tank, but we were also an activist center. We had a press. You saw our book up there. We published a few publications. We had a newsletter. Some of us who were also parents helped to create a school, the Learning House, that somebody I know went to. So we were an organization that also connected deeply with many of the intellectuals of the time who came. And we had something like conversations at a big conference table. And that's where I met Margaret Walker, sitting at the conference table, talking about her work, talking about Richard Wright, talking about other kinds of things like that. But there is so much more work to do to tell some of the stories of what we were doing in those periods of time. But I thank you so much, and I'm so happy to devour your book. And also, it pushes me to go and tell my own story. I've journaled since the 60s, too. And I just have them collected everywhere and haven't done anything about it. But so I'm encouraged to tell my own story.
Thank you. So I'll just tell you, I was actually a little divided when I did How I Wrote Jubilee is one of the collection of essays, because I didn't want people to think that there had not been a previous issue of that. And so the Institute published
Yes,
How I Wrote Jubilee as a separate monograph.
yes.
I simply use it as the title essay for the collection, but I was very concerned about people not knowing and thinking that somehow that was a discovery. But it was already published ages before.
Yes.
But it was a small press. You know, IBW had gone by that time. But she
Right.
was an avid supporter, and she knew Vincent Harding extremely well, of course.
Right, at Active Press, and we had a person who printed on our press most of the time was a woman. My name is Aljosie Aldrich Harding. I was Vincent Harding's second wife. And so there's just so much. There's just so much that you're revealing that I want to share and get launched out to do my own work.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more, if there's one more question.
Yes, I came straight from class. But, okay, so first I do want to say thank you for your work too, because I
Can you
did.
take your mask off?
Oh.
It still muffles your voice a little bit.
This better. I also speak softly. But, so I didn't know who Margaret Walker was until January 22. I read Jubilee and then How I Wrote Jubilee and other essays and the conversation with Nikki Giovanni, and I was just like, want to learn more. So I want to say thank you, and also for like the way you show like the humanity, like the full person is just like something that I feel like I don't guess I don't encounter often. Usually it's like this person was heroic and perfect. So I'm curious on what do you think, how do you think other people, like what do you think the cause of that is? Of this like almost flattening of the person, not showing the full humanity and complexity, but also like what could like other people learn from that, and what could we kind of like, how can we move forward from and do more like what you have done?
That's a good question because I'm still, well, first of all, this is my first biography. I'm an academic scholar, so the books that I write are books to be used in the classroom to educate people. I go from the classroom to the book, back to the classroom, and thinking about learning and knowledge. And so biography is a very interesting genre. And I read biography, though, and I love to read biography. And I don't think I found one that did what I thought biography could do. But also I had this treasure trove. I had these journals. And I had Walker's ghost saying, I couldn't finish my memoirs. She couldn't finish. She couldn't finish the books that she has books. She has so many books that have not been published that were not all finished, but that remain to be. So that, in my sense, was, well, if I keep her voice in the book and I can still tell her story, then maybe the readers will appreciate understanding the depth of this person and all the different people. I mean, she was multiple people. I mean, I have to say that. I mean, when you call it multiple personalities, I mean, she could get angry. She was angry with me for 5 years about something very simple, and she could be that way. And so I wanted to see a human being that has faults but also this brilliance and that balance that was sometimes creating tension, and it must have been there from the very birth. I mean, it was there from a childhood when her parents couldn't tell her to do anything, and she would go out, but she was also deeply passionate. She'd come home and be excited about stuff, tell her parents, and they would poo-poo it rather than try to help nurture that creativity or that desire, that thought. But they were parents of their time, and we know that. So I don't know what people will learn. I mean, whether the genre can be, my voice is in the book, my perspective and my bias, I'm sure, her voice. And the other thing is I interviewed as many people as I could. Most of those people are dead. I really feel like that was the contribution of the book. I mean, the families, her husband's family, because there was a lot of conflict about what was going on in that relationship. So I talked to the sisters and the aunts and the cousins over wine in North Carolina. They were drinking, not me, because I wanted to get the story straight. But so I wanted to hear, and I want their voice, and I'm glad that their voice has got to be included in there. So I don't know what people will take from it, but because I was experimenting in a lot of ways. But thank you for asking me that question that I can't fully answer.
How long were you working on the book? She wants to know.
Well, I'm sorry, what?
She wants to know how long were you working on the book?
Oh, gosh, I thought okay. I probably say I worked on the book consistently 15 years. But the conception of the book is probably more like 20 years. And, I had my life too, and all kinds of things happen, so you stop, you start, you stop. But I say consistently because even if I put it down for 6 months, I take another 3 months and go back to it, so I count that as consistent. But those other 5 years, long periods of stretches when nothing could get done, so that's why I left those out. But part of that was also me growing into the work. I think it would take me less time to do something else, and also I'm not teaching. And, all the other stuff that we do, a different stage of my life now. But yeah, it took a long time. And also, I was uncertain if what I had written, I was ready for somebody to see. All writers have that experience, but you get more comfortable with it over time.
Well, I think we can all agree that it was time very well spent. Thank you for this book and
thank
for this
you all for
conversation.
being here. Thank you.
And we'll be signing books in the foyer.
Thank you for doing this. You all know this lady, the genius of our writing in the South, making us all much more visible to the world, and living in the South that Walker didn't think she was supposed to do, but she did it too. So I like the idea that we have a whole generation that has grown up in a different spirit.
Oh, thank you.